What is up, Prayer Circle? It's your boy Eddie, coming back to you with some more long-form content. Now, for any of you who know me in real life, which is all of you, because we have 10 subscribers, I'm only giving this in case we get that coveted 11 subscribers. 10 subscriber special coming soon. No, it's not. But for any of you who know me in real life, you know that my favorite genre of anything is fantasy. I love fantasy. I love fantasy worlds. Fantasy worlds, wonderful, immaculate, amazing. And my favorite fantasy world is the Elder Scrolls. Now, for any of our viewers out there, you're probably only familiar with the Elder Scrolls through Skyrim, maybe Oblivion, and I'm sure you're saying, Eddie, that's kind of basic. The Elder Scrolls is a very surface-level fantasy universe. But for a couple of you, you know that the Elder Scrolls is not. It's really weird, it's really metaphysical, and it's just all around just kind of strange. So that's kind of what I love about it. But, you know, getting into something like this can be very difficult because it's difficult to find a good starting point to getting into some of the weirder aspects of the lore, apart from, you know, just reading the books that are in-game. So, this is what this video is seeking to do. Get people into those weirder aspects of the lore. And I figure, what better place to start than the beginning? Couple creation myths, all very basic, just because it's very difficult to really get into it without, you know, just explaining large swaths of games and whatnot, and explaining a bunch of weird other deep lore concepts. So, yeah, we're just going into it, seeing how it goes.
What is this Outlander doing in the heart chamber? Is blood Nerevar?
Before I begin talking about the start of the Elder Scrolls universe, it's important to understand that there's no real set objective beginning to it. Rather, what we're seeing is a myriad of unique cultures with different values and whatnot, all seeing the same event and running it through their own lenses of interpretations and values and etc. and etc. and etc. until what we get is basically an account of the same events with, you know, the same kind of archetypes running through them, the same through lines running through each of them, but all told through a different perspective, a different set of cultural values and whatnot. So, yeah, it's kind of tough to talk about it. Also, there's this concept like myth makes reality, which is basically like if enough people believe something happened, it did happen. And, you know, there's contradictory sets of views duking it out that are also equally true. So, yeah, it's kind of tough to talk about this stuff. That being said, we're going to tackle it. We're going to tackle a couple big ones. And we're going to start with the High Elves, just because both in-universe and out-of-universe, a lot of people take their account almost like gospel, which, if you've been listening to the past, like, 45 seconds of rambling, you should know it's kind of stupid to take anything like gospel, but they take it because the High Elves are old. So, we're going to start with them. We're going to move on. I will be primarily drawing from the monomyth to tell their creation story. I'm going to read a few excerpts of it. I'm not doing that for any of the other creation accounts, but I will read a few excerpts of the monomyth's account, the High Elven creation account, as well as a couple other sources of theirs. So I'll link all my sources in the bottom of the video, like the little description thing. You know what I'm talking about, gang. And we'll go from there. Before we really get into all of this, there's a couple through lines that I figured that I just sort of explain that show up in just about every myth, if almost every myth. And I'm not going over every single creation myth in the Elder Scrolls, by the way. I'm going through like 4. Some of them get really weird, and I'm not about to try and break those down for you guys, because again, what I'm doing is I'm breaking down these myths and making them palatable, so someone who's just getting into Elder Scrolls lore is able to have a jumping off point. And who knows, maybe I'll make other videos about lore topics just so people actually have a starting point to dive in. This is not a deep dive by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just glossing over some surface level stuff and helping interpret some more confusing texts, and we're going on from there. So, basically, I'm going to give you some through lines that show up in just about every single myth, and we'll move on from there. We'll move on straight into the heart of the world, which is the name of the High Elven creation myth. And for all of you nerds out there, no, I'm not covering the Sigic interpretation that shows up in the beginning of the monomyth. I'm not getting into that right now. It's just, I'm not. But anyways, there's a few big through lines. One, of course, is duality. Almost every single creation myth has these two competing forces, usually called something like Anu and Padme or something like that. And Anu is this force that represents stasis and light and order and things like that. And Padme is like change and chaos and darkness. Not like moral light and dark. These aren't really moral forces. Like, as humans, we perceive morality onto them, but they're not moral forces. They're honestly not even gods really, in the sense that we would think of gods. They're like basically the concepts of order and chaos. They're like primeval forces and whatnot. Anyways, so we have Anu and Padme, right? And then another big through line that we see is Akatosh, who is the time god you might remember from if you've played Skyrim or Oblivion. I'm assuming you guys have at least played one Elder Scrolls game. If not, this is going to be really weird. I'm not going to try and break it down any further than if someone hasn't played an Elder Scrolls game. Like, if you haven't played one, just literally hop onto one for like 5 minutes. It's not difficult. Like Morrowind, not the remastered, the original. Not Morrowind, sorry. You should play Morrowind. Morrowind's really good. Oblivion is not that expensive, and it's pretty easy to get into. Just download it. I'm sure if you have a functioning laptop, you can run it now. But yeah, no, just play an Elder Scrolls game and get back to me. There's Akatosh. He usually shows up, the time god, and then Lorkharn. He usually shows up in all of these myths. He's like a trickster god. So now that we understand some of these through lines, let's get on with it. Again, so for the High Elven creation myth, I'm primarily drawing on the monomyth. However, I'm also using some other sources to talk about it. Again, if you want to find it, linked in the description. The monomyth specifically for this part, look for the Heart of the World section. And to begin, I'm just going to read off the opening lines of it, just so we know what we're talking about here. I will not do this with other myths. I will only do it for the Elven one. So you do not have to worry. You will not hear me reading all of the myths. That would take a very long time. Anu encompassed, and encompasses all things. So that he might know himself better, he created Anuiel, his soul, and the soul of all things. Anuiel, as all souls, was given to self-reflection, and for this he needed to differentiate between his forms, attributes, and intellects. Thus was born Sithis, who was the sum of all limitations. Anuiel would utilize to ponder himself. Anuiel, who was the soul of all things, therefore became many things, and this interplay was the Arbus. Alright, so, it's kind of a lot if you're not an uber nerd like me, so I'm going to try and break this down the best as I can. So, right off the bat, we obviously have Anu, right? You remember me talking about Anu. Anu was order, light, stasis, all that good stuff, right? The High Elves, they really venerate the Anuic aspects of the world, if you will. So like those parts that are order and stasis, they view Anu as a force of good, right? Now, Anu doesn't really know himself, wants to be able to reflect on himself, so he creates Anuiel, which is the soul of his soul. Now, Anuiel is a god, but he's not really a god. Once again, kind of like Anu, he's a god. He's not a god in the way we think. Because although Anuiel is like kind of conscious now, he's semi-conscious, he doesn't really have an ego, right? So, in order so that he could differentiate between the aspects of himself, which is literally everything, so, you know, things could develop an ego, he creates Sithis, okay? Now, making sure we're following. We got Anu, Anuiel, Sithis. I will put a diagram up here so we understand what came where in which order. Anu, Anuiel, Sithis. Got it? Good. Okay, so basically, from Sithis, he's able to divide the aspects of Anuiel so they're able to ponder themselves. Now, I'm going to get on to reading the next section of this myth, now that we got all that down. At first, the Arbus was turbulent and confusing, as Anuiel's ruminations went on without design. Aspects of the Arbus then asked for a schedule to follow procedures, whereas they might enjoy themselves a little longer outside of perfect knowledge. So that he might know himself this way too, Anu created Anuiel, the soul of his soul. Ario began to bleed through the Arbus as a new force called time. With time, various aspects of the Arbus began to understand their natures and limitations. They took names like Magnus or Mara or Zin. One of these, Lorkharn, was more of a limit than a nature, so it could never last long anywhere. Once again, a lot, but not as much as the last section, so this should be a little easier to break down. Basically, all of these things existed in a sort of timeless state. There was no such thing as linear time. Events were not triggered by, actions or whatever, right? Things would just sort of happen because they happened in this sort of timeless state. So all of these things asked to, exist within some sort of coherent structure. So Anuiel creates Ariel, which Ariel is that Akatosh archetype, right? So again, we have Anu, Anuiel, who creates Sithis, who's basically his opposite. That's that Patamaic aspect in there, right? So we have Anu, Anuiel, Sithis, and then we have all of the gods, but chief among them is the spirit of Anuiel, the soul of his soul, which is Ariel, right? And of course, the last part of that, we learn about Lorkharn, which I've already talked to you about, right? Lorkharn is the trickster god. He's the, more Patamaic aspect as well in this story, right? Because there's almost no real Patamaic influence in the beginning of the story, right? A lot of cultures talk about Anu and Padme being these forces that clash with each other, but the elves only talk about Anu, and then eventually they talk about Sithis, which isn't really the same as Padme, so it's a little interesting. I'm going to be summarizing the last little sections of this. I'm probably going to read one more little passage, maybe. We'll see. I have a little passage over here to read if I need to, but other than that, I'm just sort of going to paraphrase the rest of this. Anyways, Lorkharn is obviously more akin to Sithis or Padme or what have you as compared to the rest of the spirits. So he devises this little plot. He devises a little scheme. He decides he's going to create a house of Sithis, a place based exclusively on limitation. So he approaches the other Et-Ada, which, new word check, Et-Ada. Et-Ada is the original spirit. So these are the gods in this form, right? This sort of loosey-goosey, Anuic form, where there's no limitations and they're all just sort of chilling and ethereous and whatnot, right? So anyways, he approaches the gods in this form and basically pitches this idea of a place that they could reflect upon themselves as, Anu reflected upon himself and Anuiel reflected upon himself. And he calls this place, Mundus, right? The Gray Maybe. And he gets a lot of them on board. He even gets Ariel on board, the soul of the soul, right? By telling him he will be the ruler of this place. So, of course, they all throw their divine power into making this place, and almost immediately they start getting their divine power sucked because they have to sacrifice a part of themselves to make this world. Now, of course, some of them realize this almost immediately. Magnus begins to fly out as fast as he can as soon as he realizes what is happening. By the way, Magnus was supposed to be the architect for this project, so he designs all of Mundus, and the moment that he realizes he's going to lose his power, he dips, and he rips a hole through the sky. A hole that's so big, it becomes the sun. Because in the Elder Scrolls universe, the sun is just a large tear in the sky into a, realm of pure magic, which is kind of nuts. Anyways, a bunch of other spirits follow him, and they all rip holes in the sky too. And those are the stars, which means the stars are also rips in the sky into a place made of pure magic. Anyways, some of them sacrifice themselves, become the earth bones, right? And that basically means that they stabilize the world and make sure that, it can continue to exist. A bunch of the weaker spirits begin to die. Ariel pleads with Anu to let them back into the Arbis, right? Or not the Arbis, Aetherius, which is the godly realm, right? But of course, Anu has already filled it with other things, and he can't really make sense of what's happening. He doesn't have any sort of consciousness. But Anuiel, who has proto-consciousness, feels bad for him, so he gives him his bow and a shield to take revenge on Lorkharn, right? So, yeah, they all go. They fight Lorkharn. There's a big battle that actually gets retold in the Nords, who we'll be covering next, their myth. And, it goes pretty well for the elves. By the way, the elves think of themselves as those weaker spirits, like those incredibly weak spirits who stay true to the old way. They believe that Lorkharn, actually, in this new realm, he grabbed some of the original spirits and corrupted them into the men, right? Anyways, this war happens. They're all clashing. They're all fighting. And eventually, Lorkharn loses. He gets his heart yanked out by Trenimac, right, who's Ariel's champion. But, of course, as anyone who's played Morrowind knows, that's not the end of that. Because although Lorkharn's dead, his heart is not. His heart's still beating. And it says something along the lines of, this heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other, as its explanation for why it's still going. So, Ariel does the next best thing. Takes the heart, ties it to an arrow, and pops it into the sea. Falls into the sea, boom! A massive volcano sprouts where it landed. That volcano is Red Mountain for anyone who's played more than just Skyrim or Oblivion. And that's the plot of Morrowind, really. That's kind of the driving catalyst, is the heart at the center of Red Mountain, but we're not going to get into all of that. All you need to know is that's the end of the Elven creation myth. And now we're moving on to the Nords. Ugh, sorry. Wine break, and I'm taking off this because it is hot. So hot right now. In this room, there's no AC in it, in my house. Anyways, the Nords. The Nords. We love the Nords. The Nords are basically the same as the Elven creation myth, only it's told from a different perspective, right, of that war. The thing is, with the Nordic creation myth, it's a little hard to paraphrase a source about it because the Nords don't really have a set source for their creation myth. Now, there is one really good source called Shor-son-shor-full. That being said, it is an incredibly confusing text. I am linking in the description. I am not going to explain it because it has to do with stuff like the Kalpic cycle. Those uber nerds out there know what that is. I'm not trying to explain that right now. All you need to know is the Nords really do believe in this repetitive flow of the universe, right? So their creation myth picks up right where, we're in the middle of a war, right? And they really do believe in this repetitive cycle, and like Lorkharn's talking with Lorkharn, they call Lorkharn Shor, and it's a whole thing. I'm not going to try and explain it. But the Nords are a prime example of how it's basically just events told from a different perspective, right? The Nords believe that Lorkharn was low-key based. They believe that he was totally justified in what he did, and they're very grateful. They're much more Padmaic in their reverence, right? I was talking about Anu and Padme earlier, and how the elves are more Anuic. Yeah, the Nords are more Padmaic. They revere forces like change and whatnot. I really like the Nords and their cultural outlook on the world. They're really racist in Skyrim, but honestly, in terms of Elder Scrolls racism, there's definitely more racist races. So, could be worse, I guess. I don't like ranking fantasy racism, but if I had to rank their fantasy racism, it's probably a C tier. You don't want to know what the Dark Elves do to people. Anyways, so, there's not much to really talk about with the Nordic creation myth, other than it's basically the same as the Elves, because it's just told from a different perspective of the war, and there's like little fragments of what's happening there. Yeah, no. Here's something interesting, though, for all of you who have played Skyrim. The Nordic conception of Akatosh is Alduin. That's right, the main antagonist of the game you're playing. They do this weird insert where he's like, oh, I'm the firstborn of Akatosh, or whatever, right, in the games. But in, like, an early lore, dude, that was just Akatosh. You are literally fighting Akatosh. You are fighting a god. You are fighting the god that that helped you at the end of Oblivion, which is kind of nuts. Now, of course, with new lore, there's all sorts of stuff like with the Oversoul and whatnot. Once again, we're not looking to get into all that. We're trying to keep this simple. So all you got to really know is they have a bunch of different names for different gods, right? But functionally, they're telling the same story, just from a different perspective. Anyways, time to move on to a creation myth with some actual substance that's different and recorded. So we're going to talk next about the Red Guards. The Red Guards. The Red Guards have a pretty cool myth. I like the Red Guards. They're very unique in terms of myths, specifically human myths, because I don't know if I explained this earlier. I probably did. But in case I didn't, basically, a lot of the human myths are very Padmaic in nature. They venerate those more chaotic elements of creation. They really like Padme. They think he was based. That is not true of the Red Guards. They're very Anuic, kind of like the elves, with the exception of the Dark Elves. Yeah, no, they venerate Anu more so. They like that idea of return to a state before creation. So, yeah, they're very unique in terms of humans. So, with that out of the way, let's get into their creation myth. Oh, quick disclaimer, I'm not as familiar with some of the names in the Red Guard creation myth, so you might see me like this over on my computer in case I forget a name. Hopefully I won't. I'm still familiar with the story. I'm still going to be able to paraphrase it pretty well. But just a heads up if I'm like, that's probably because I don't remember a name. Anyways, so, to begin, we start with their Anu figure, kind of like how the High Elves started with, their Anu figure. Theirs is called Satic or Sodic or whatever. It's the world serpent for them, right? It's this big old serpent that is literally so big that it is all of existence and nothing else has any room to exist apart from Satic or Sodic or whatever, secret third pronunciation. Problem is all of his scales are little worlds or spirits or what have you. The text calls them worlds, which, by the way, I'm using the monomyth, link in the description if you want to read this source for yourself. But they act more like spirits. They act like those primal gods. Anyways, they all want to exist. It's very tough for them to exist, and so they call out into the void for any sort of help. Problem is, there is no void. There's only Sadik. So hope can't come from Sadik himself, so it has to come from within him. So up jumps Akel, I think. I'm going to double check that. Here's me checking that computer like I said I would. Akel, right. Akel, the hungry stomach. So Akel basically has Sadik begin to eat himself. And as he begins to eat himself, the spirits can begin to exist. Now, at first they really suck at existing because it's their first time existing. And they're just sort of dying off and things are violent and messy and whatnot, right? But it's whatever. Eventually, Sadik eats so much of himself, he climbs around and bites his own heart, kills himself. That's the end of that. Problem is, Akel, who is their Patamaic figure, right? He's that instigating force of change. He's not quite satisfied with how much he's eaten, so he causes Sadik to shed his own skin and begin eating away anew. And when all the spirits of the world see this or whatever, right? What have you, they all know what they have to do. They see this cycle of eat, die, shed, repeat, and they figure out a way to get around it, sneak around this cycle by, and my hand to God, this is what is in the text, walking at strange angles. Whatever that means, they walk at strange angles to avoid this fate. They get so good at it that it eventually ends up becoming a place called the Walkabout. And they set stars in the sky to help other spirits get there. Of course, some of the spirits are very good at helping. One of the best ones is Tall Papa. That's not his original name. I don't remember what his original name is, but they start calling him Tall Papa. And this is your Ario figure, or your Akatosh figure, right? Anyways, Tall Papa gets really sick of helping, so he decides to create for himself a helper out of some of the dead skin and a little bit of the hungry stomach. So he creates the second serpent called Sep. And Sep is extremely hungry. So sometimes, instead of helping the spirits, he'll just eat them. But of course, Tall Papa reaches into his mouth, pulls out the spirits, and he can help them cross over to the far shores, which is, in case you forgot, that place that they created by walking. Eventually, Sep gets pretty sick of helping Tall Papa, so he takes some of the spirits and says that the only way to avoid this cycle is instead to take some of the skin of one of the, dead versions of Sadik and lump it all together and create a new world. That's the way that you avoid this. So the spirits do this because it's way easier than walking at strange angles, whatever that means. Tall Papa's pretty disappointed. They create a world, and by now you know the drill. Their powers begin to leave. They begin to die off. There's nothing they can do. They beg to, go back, but this time they can't because it's too far of a leap, so they got to figure out how to do it through their children. And Tall Papa is a little disappointed and goes up to Sep, and he takes them, and he crushes them with a big stick, and he spits out the hunger, and that's the end of that. So, all in all, pretty cool story. That big stick, by the way, is the Adamantine Tower, which only means anything for anyone that's played Daggerfall. Or, I guess it would mean stuff for other people who've read in-game text. Basically, the Adamantine Tower is where all the gods convened to rip out Lorkharn's heart and shoot him or judge him or whatever, right? So, that's the Red Guards. Pretty vivid creation myth. I really like it, but yeah, no, it's definitely one of the more interesting ones, and I'm going to cover one last creation myth today. Some of you might be thinking it's the Khajiit because, that's another one that's in the monomyth. It's not. I'm covering the Imperials. The Imperials, the most famous, arguably, creation myth, coming straight from the heartland of Cirid, which is where they all live if you paid attention to that description in the character creation menu. This is the one that most people are familiar with because it has the most familiar names, right? Akatosh and whatnot, right? Akatosh. You know other gods, don't you? Beside Akatosh? Anyways, so yeah, no, they call it Lorkharn Shazar, which is a little unique. But yeah, once again, their creation myth comes from the monomyth. It's linked in the description, right? It's called Shezar's Song. So, if you want to read it for yourself, you can. So basically, their creation myth picks up right in the middle of Lorkharn trying to convince the rest of them into creation, right? And some of them really like this idea of becoming parents, right? He sings to them about parenthood and giving up your power to become something new. So they all take part in this creation. Well, some of them don't, and last new term of the day, these are the Daedra, which, if you've only played Skyrim, you probably just think of them as, demon stand-ins, but in reality, they're actually stronger than the Aedra, because they never gave up their power, which is kind of antithetical to how a lot of fantasy runs, right? But anyways, so the demons don't partake, But the Aedra do, and the Aedra, of course, are just those who partook in creation. So all the Aedra come together and create this new world. And when they do, there are two sects of gods. There are the elven gods, and there are the human gods. The elven gods are things like Ariel and whatnot, and Ariel is like, I feel tricked, I'm brooding, I don't like this at all. And of course the human gods, actually are very proud of their creation, and they're a big fan of it. And the Daedra say everyone's stupid, and they create their own little pocket realms in Oblivion, and they have their own little Dremora and whatnot that they're playing with, and they didn't lose any of their power, because their realm's a part of themselves, but secretly they envy the Aedra, right, for their part in creation. Now, I hear you saying, wait a second, Eddie. From what I remember, you said Ariel and Akatosh, they're the same god. And this is that myth makes reality stuff, right? Yeah, they're the same god, but, because the Imperials believe they're separate, they're also separate. It's, the Imperials' fault, and also the fault of the Monkey Man in the First Era, but we're not going to get into all that, because I'm not going to break down a text called The Monkey Truth in a Elder Scrolls video for beginners. That's just a little much, even for me. So, yeah, no, not happening. Maybe if this becomes a series where I explain some of these deeper lore concepts, we might get to the monkey truth, and if you want to, I'll break down the monkey truth. But, yeah, it's definitely one of the weirder aspects of Elder Scrolls lore. And with that, I think we're done, honestly. I don't know what else we really have to talk about. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe if this gets successful enough, I'll create a series off of it. Like I said, if you guys really like it, I'll make a second one. But in reality, this is just sort of a back burner project that I happened to complete the outline in script form. And then I ran it through 3 different drafts. Initially, I wasn't going to show up at all in this video. I was just going to have myself voicing over this long script, which I did not stick to at all. I had it up for names, but I didn't stick to that. I just sort of went off the cuff of the wrist because I really didn't like that initial turnout where it was just video of my awful Skyrim build and nice little scenic views and whatnot as I voiced over that script. And initially the script was a lot longer too, because I went into a couple other myths. I went into the Khajiit myth and whatnot, and I talked a little bit about what the Dark Elves believe in terms of metaphysics, which of course then I have to get into the triangle truth and whatnot. But I figured that was all a little much, it was a little too long, and I didn't really need all that. So once again, I hope you guys enjoyed. There's another video coming very shortly. It's my little Brandon Sanderson analysis part 2. I'm going to try and do a better analysis of the Way of Kings, and also not summarize, I don't summarize, I hate summarizing. I think it's stupid. I'm going to give my review, I suppose, of his second book, Words of Radiance, because I'm just about done with that, and give some comparisons to my dear friend's fanfiction again. And with that, that's the video. Once again, hope you liked all of it. Please hit subscribe if you enjoyed this, and yeah, see ya. Hey guys, post-production Eddie here. Almost forgot to say this. All of the art that I'm using, go check the description. Support those artists. Yeah, I'm obviously going to be using some art for transitions. I haven't edited it yet. I'm going to basically spend minimal amount of time editing this because I'm honestly just really wanting to get this out because it's been on my back burner for a bit on how I was going to structure this and whatnot. So, yeah, no, go support those artists. Please support those artists. Check the links in the description. Go follow their pages. They're all cool.